So this is going to be a kind of a lot of politics today. Other times we'll talk about sort of street life and urban culture, but today is a lot of revolutions and protests and high politics. And when I teach classes on French history, I always begin by asking students about what their stereotypes of France are, and sort of what their stereotypes of French politics are. And invariably, I get three things. So I get that the French are farther to the left than the US politically. I get that France has a sort of much more unstable political system than the US, right? So they're on their fifth republic. Many more constitutions, because there are other things other than the republics that they have since the first republic. We're on our first. And I also get that the French are bad at war. And, so I think that, there's truth and, complications to sort of all of these. But I say this because we're going to touch on all of these things and how these differences really shape the period that we're going to talk about, which is the Third Republic. So in terms of the kind of overview, the general themes, the Third Republic is this period from 1870 to 1940, and we're really going to talk about how it emerges from France's revolutionary heritage, this sort of long century of turmoil, of trying to figure out a stable political system. And then we'll talk about the Third Republic in a way as not necessarily the culmination, but as a system that is actually, it's the most long-lasting of France's republics and political systems since the Revolution. Right, it lasts for, my math is right, 70 years, yes, 70 years. And as finding some degree of stability, but I think we're gonna have to put that in question marks, even though the Republic begins in absolute calamity, total military collapse, and civil war. And so we're going to think about why it is that the Third Republic actually lasts as long as it does, because a lot of people who began the regime, right, are sort of its founders, don't want it to last. And we're going to think about this as a product of luck, and some, I would describe it as kind of comedic circumstances. We're also going to talk about a new type of republicanism that emerges in the Third Republic that's very different from the sort of previous types of republicanism. And then we're going to talk about the origins of really republican institutions in France, in particular schools, as, right, the sort of the laboratory of the Republic. And I just want to say, because I always have to say this to my students, that when we talk about republicanism in this class, we're not talking about in the American political context. So it's not, right, a political party. It's not sort of, right, people who, are different than Democrats. It's instead basically the same as Democrats. People who want democracy, people who want, right, sort of no king, and instead a regime built on democracy. So I just want to, in case anyone is getting a little confused, because, right, sort of when we read the news, we read a lot, and this is just a different way of thinking about sort of, it's the French meaning of the term, or the original meaning of the term. All right, so I'm going to begin with where all modern French politics begins, and that's the Revolution. And I should say that in winter, I had the great joy of teaching a seminar on the Revolution, so I get 12 weeks to cover essentially 5 years. I'm going to try and compress it down to as sort of short as possible, but it's breaking my heart a little bit. So in 1789, the old regime, France's political system that has lasted for centuries ends, right, with the beginning of the Revolution. And at this early stage, what most people want is they want a constitutional monarchy. And that would limit the powers of the monarch, right? So at the time, Louis XVI, with a representative system. So something a little bit like Britain, right? With a sort of House of Parliament and then also a monarch. And the people who are writing the Constitution, the people who are in the kind of National Assembly, also want a system based on restricted suffrage, right? So not everyone would have the vote, only the wealthiest would have the vote, although the suffrage is actually pretty broad. That effort, as you know, fails because Louis XVI head is separated from his body during the revolution. And it fails for a lot of reasons, but I'm going to point out two reasons. So the first is war, which begins in 1792, and it really becomes a war with all of Europe that lasts until Napoleon's fall in 1815. So, right, this sort of decades of really destabilizing warfare. And the war begins in part out of France's desire to spread revolutionary ideals, to sort of bring liberty and equality to the rest of Europe. And war, as you know, raises political stakes. It's hard to remain neutral during a wartime. And it also puts power in the hands of what we would call the sort of urban working class, right? Because they're the people who are the backbone of the army. And so it means that, right, they become incredibly important to the survival of the revolution, the survival also of France. The other reason that this effort to create a kind of moderate political system, constitutional monarchy, fails is because you have a king who isn't willing to go along with the revolution. He's an absolutist. And he's sort of maybe willing to share a little power, but he essentially is hostile to the revolution. And this is a problem that really plagues France, as you'll see, for a century. Is they have this difficulty finding a sort of king-like figure who is willing to keep some of the gains of the revolution. So in August 1792, the king is overthrown. And the First Republic is proclaimed based on universal manhood suffrage, so all men get the vote. As you probably know, the revolution rapidly radicalizes, leading to the Terror, which is this period of about a year, 1793, 1794, of really sort of fear, instability, violence. When anyone suspected of being counter-revolutionary might be executed, even on no grounds at all. This is also this period, the Terror is also this period of really radical attacks on the Catholic Church and attempts to sort of unroot the Catholic Church, which had been interwoven in the political system and people's lives for centuries from France. So I want to talk about the legacy of this period because it has this really profound legacy for France and for all of Europe. And so one is that in the 19th century, democracy all over Europe and of course in France is associated with violence. Right? So it's associated with instability, it's associated with anarchy, it's associated with ideological violence, and it's also associated with war. Right? So they don't see democracy as sort of peaceful, a kind of harmony of nations. Instead, the idea is if you start opening up a system to make it more democratic, you are going to have chaos and the guillotine. The other thing is that there is this deep hostility which lasts well into the 20th century between French republicanism and the Catholic Church, right? So that these are enemies, and a lot of people are forced to choose between one or the other. And so people, they make these decisions based on their affiliation with the Republic or their affiliation with the Catholic Church. So this leads to this sort of long period of instability in the 19th century. And I'm not going to talk much about these different regimes. So these are all of the regimes from the end of the revolution, which is really ended by Napoleon's seizure of power, to the Third Republic, which begins in 1870. And again, it breaks my heart not to talk about these regimes in sort of a great deal of detail. You have obviously sort of Napoleon and the First Empire, this period of really kind of, right, again, just colossal warfare that engulfs all of Europe. What happens then is, that doesn't work out so well. France is kind of tired of war. The rest of Europe is kind of tired of war. And so in 1815, the Bourbon monarchy comes back with the Bourbon Restoration. And these are the brothers of Louis XVI, that executed king. They don't fare so well because they're not really willing to be anything other than absolutists. And so they are overthrown in a revolution in 1830. Then in the July Monarchy, which is known as the July Monarchy, because 1830 is a revolution that happens in July, the cousins of the king come back, Louis Philippe. It's the Orleans branch, so it's like a sort of different branch of the royal family, basically cousins. The hope is that he'd be a little more sort of open to sort of opening up the political system, a little less authoritarian. He's not. And so he's overthrown in this really big revolution that, again, engulfs all of Europe, 1848. You have this period, this very brief, extremely unstable period of the Second Republic. Doesn't last that long. Napoleon, so this Napoleon is actually Napoleon's nephew. He comes into power quite quickly and really takes over the Second Republic and then just formally seizes power and declares himself emperor. So I think the way that you can really think about this is that in the 19th century, there's really this effort to put the genie of democracy back in the bottle, right? It was unleashed during the revolution, and it's a little bit dangerous. And there's really this kind of desire to have political elites really have this desire to have a political system that's more stable, that right is kind of doesn't lead to violence. And so these regimes, the Restoration, the July Monarchy, the reign of Napoleon III, tend to be quite repressive. They tend to restrict free press, very restricted franchise in some of them, often using the military to put down workers. And so you have political elites who want stability, who want peace. And I think that's something that we could understand, but I think likewise we could understand why many common people want democracy. And so these two desires are constantly coming into conflict with one another. And that's why you have this period of enormous instability. And you have these two revolutions in particular, 1830, 1848, which are these popular uprisings that begin in Paris and overthrow monarchies. And they arise out of a demand for democracy. Increasingly, too, this demand for democracy is linked to socialism. So this era, sort of 1830s, 1840s, is an era of industrialization. It's a sort of first wave of industrialization in France. So you have these cities, Paris in particular, that have a larger and larger population of poor and disenfranchised workers who are increasingly kind of attracted to socialist ideals. And they have this feeling, which is that they keep doing all this work to overthrow repressive regimes, but they never get the benefits from it, right? So what happens is they go out on the barricades, they fight to overthrow the Bourbon monarchs, and then they just get another king who behaves exactly like the Bourbon monarchs. So there's this sort of seething discontent with this political system. And I want to talk in particular about why there's such instability. And I want to point out two things. So one is that this is an incredibly divided nation. And, you know, just absolute polarization. And we talk in the American political context about polarization and sort of deep divisions over politics. It's nothing like France in the 19th century. Because basically we agree, I mean, I don't think there are many monarchists out there, right? We agree that there should be a president and a bicameral legislature and a judiciary, and that we're going to stick with the Constitution, right? We have that sort of basic agreement. That is not true in France, where you have everything from people who see that the only legitimate political system is one that is based on absolute divine right monarchy, to people who see that the only legitimate political system is a socialist utopia. And there's everything in between, from people who want a constitutional monarchy to people who want, right, a sort of moderate democracy. And so this is this really kind of dramatic inability to agree on what France should look like in a really fundamental way. And I think that one of the ways to understand this is that these divides are not just ideological, but unsurprisingly class-based, geographical, religious, and gendered ones. And so I'm going to run through those categories. So, unsurprisingly, you have a lot of elites who really don't want democracy or socialism, right? And again, unsurprisingly, you have a lot of workers in cities who really don't want absolute monarchy and want sort of socialism or democracy. So that's class divides. That's, I think, a kind of relatively obvious one. Geographical divides. That's also something which I think you could understand relatively obvious. So there's a big divide in cities. They tend to be much, much more radical, right? Whereas many in the countryside, France is predominantly peasantry, it's predominantly an agricultural society. They do not want socialism, they want a monarchy. Many are deeply attached to the church as well. So there's this geographical divide, right? There's this sort of difference between cities and the countrysides. There's also religious divides, right? So if you were an ardent Catholic, it is very unlikely that you would also be attracted to, say, socialism or democracy. There are few out there. On the other hand, if you are a non-believer, if you are Jewish, if you are Protestant, you really see the revolution as guaranteeing your rights. So, right, there's this kind of religious difference as well. What I think is maybe most surprising is that there's a gender divide. And it's maybe not this sort of the same divide that we're used to in terms of our own politics, which is that women tend to be deeply, deeply conservative and deeply attached to the Catholic Church. And that's actually true for really kind of much of the 19th century. And it's also true in much of Europe. Sort of, we talk about really the feminization of religion in the 19th century. So you have a lot of households where the husband and wife don't agree, where the husband maybe wants democracy and maybe the wife wants monarchy. And this plays out in these really funny ways, right? So, you know, do you eat fish or not during Lent, right? Do you fast? Well, maybe the husband is going to go and have an enormous beefsteak instead, right? To sort of stick it to the Catholic Church, whereas this would be something that would be really important for the wife of the family. So you have all these sort of these divisions, right? Some of which are kind of regional or class-based, and some of which are really intimate, even within a household. I think one of the ways to think about this is through art, and I have to apologize because I'm going to totally do a terrible job talking about art in my lectures, but you've probably seen this Delacroix painting, Liberty Leading the People. It's a representation of the Revolution of 1830. And produced just after. And here you see this figure of liberty, right, the sort of Marianne, who's the sort of French national icon, holding the tricolor flag, the symbol, that the flag that's created in the revolution. And she is surrounded by a variety of Parisian types. So you see this guy, and you see his top hat. He is a member of the bourgeoisie. Right? Top hats were what members of the bourgeoisie wore. On the other hand, this guy right here is a worker because he has a cap, and that's what urban workers would wear. And then this kid here is a kind of recognizable Parisian type of this street urchin, basically. And so here you see all of them united, men and women, rich and poor, united together to bring the revolution forward, right? And it's this dream of unity, right? A dream of a unified nation, and this is a lie. Because this is not how people were feeling, right? Maybe they were feeling it in sort of the immediate aftermath of the revolution, but a year or two later, this is not how they would be feeling, right? That you would have this class divide, you would have workers really unhappy with the regime, wanting to push it forward, wanting to bring revolution back, and you would have really sort of a bourgeoisie that's deeply conservative and entrenched in maintaining order and preventing what they see as this kind of the anarchy of democracy. So I think that's one way to understand this deep instability. The other, which is really important to our class, is the role of Paris. So, Paris is the biggest city in France. It is also the political capital. It is the cultural capital, right? It's where sort of, the great artists and writers hang out. It's an economic capital, so it's, right, there's a lot of industrialization happening. And you could think it's sort of like if we took Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. and New York and combined them all into one, right? And so this centralization has a really dramatic effect on French politics. Because when you have a political capital that is the same as the largest center and an industrial center, and also the place where you have the kind of wildest ideas, right, the most radical thinkers, that means that the political system is, the masses can easily influence it, right? So that they have this ability to overthrow the regime because they are right there. Whereas if you think about why in the US do our largest cities tend not to be political capitals, right? So, the capital of New York State is not New York City, it's instead Albany. There's a reason for that, and that is you want to prevent this. Because that means you can keep the political system separate from the pressure of the masses. And so this centralization really is, I think, one of the reasons for this dramatic instability. If the capital had been based in, I don't know, like, some lovely city, Rennes in Normandy, you would have a very different French history. But because it's, right, sort of in this big city, Parisian politics becomes, in a way, the politics of the nation in a different way. And I think, so you can think both 1830 and 1848 are revolutions that take place largely, although not exclusively, in Paris, where the major fighting is in the city streets. And the major fighting is barricades, which is just, the revolutionaries, they just put a barricade up in a street, start pulling up the paving stones, and start fighting off troops. And so you see here, right, what are they climbing over? They're climbing over a barricade. So this is representation as well of urban revolt. Okay, so I want to talk about this period of Napoleon III and the Second Empire. So he comes to power really just because of his famous name. So he has, he's Napoleon's nephew. He's sort of the pretender to the Napoleonic throne. You have, in 1848, you have a revolution, and then they decide to elect a president, and he's on the ballot. And no one's, they've heard of his uncle, but he's not someone who's known in France. But a lot of people are like, oh, I know that guy. I'm going to vote for him. And there's a whole lot of peasants who say, oh, he's back. Okay, I'm going to vote for him. He was good, right? Sounds great. So he becomes president because he has this name. And he, like the other rulers that came before him, institutes a deeply authoritarian regime. There's an elected parliament, but the parliament has no real power. And there's also really dramatic press censorship. Interestingly, though, in 1860s, so the second decade of his reign, he kind of does what the other authoritarian rulers of the 19th century had not done, which is he starts actually becoming less authoritarian. And so he starts opening up the regime. He lifts certain, although certainly not all, restrictions on press censorship. He gives Parliament a lot more power. And in 1869, the government proposes a new constitution that would have established a real representative regime with a parliament that has real power. And people are in favor of this, and I think this actually might have worked. This might have created a kind of stable political system that would be democratic and representative, but would also maintain order. But as you know, Napoleon is not so great at certain things. And unlike his uncle, he's really bad at war. And so he is overthrown really in a context of military disaster. So the Franco-Prussian War, I'm not going to go into detail about the sort of how it comes to happen. I'm just going to say it's largely orchestrated by Prussia and by Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian chancellor. And he is seeking to rally other German states against the French menace. You've got another Napoleon on the throne. What is he going to do? He's going to invade Germany like his uncle did. And he thinks, well, if he can freak these other German states out, then they will unify under Prussian authority, which will be really great for Prussia. And so he essentially goads Napoleon III into starting a war. And this is the war that we call the Franco-Prussian War. The war, as you probably know, is an absolute disaster. The French army is badly commanded. The army, the sort of heads of the army, they believe that the French fighting spirit will win against the organized, disciplined, and very prepared Prussian army. This is a mistake to believe that. And so the war begins in July 1870, and in September, there's a huge defeat at Sedan, where Napoleon III is captured because he goes out to sort of be there during the battle, right? He's sort of like, I'm like my uncle, I'm gonna sort of bring warfare and victory on horseback. And soon after, news trickles back, of course, to Paris. And a few days after it does, a group of Republican deputies and a Parisian crowd say, well, we're the Third Republic now, right? And you can sort of think about this as more or less has the same real legal authority as if we in this classroom were to say, we are the Second American Republic, right? And we're going to write a new constitution. But as I say, it sticks. So this is a really, really inauspicious beginning for a governmental system, absolute military catastrophe. And very, very quickly, the government has to think about what are they going to do about the war. And there are two options. And like everything in France, this is politicized. So what the left wants to do is they want to rally the people of France and fight the Prussians. And the idea is, let's begin, let's do what we did in the first revolution, let's fight back the rest of Europe with the enthusiasm and excitement of the French people. Moderates and conservatives don't want this. And they don't want this because a lot of them are a little afraid of putting arms in the hands of the people of France and thinking that, well, they might use the arms against the Prussians, but then they might use them against, us. But they also are kind of right that they're going to lose the war anything. So capitulate early. And so meanwhile, Prussia is laying siege to Paris from September 20th to January 28th, 1871. And as you can imagine, life in Paris is tough during this siege. Food runs low, fuel runs low, industry's basically closed, so people aren't paid. And so people turn to kind of extraordinary expedients. The animals in the Paris Zoo get eaten. When I was practicing this lecture yesterday, I had to hold my hands over my dog's ears. This is a butcher's shop, and here you can see rats being sold. And then the image is a little pixelated, so I apologize for that. But canine and feline meat. Right? So yeah, right? So people have to guard their dogs against getting, poached by hungry people. Paris is also cut off from all communication. And so Paris relies, to get messages out, use hot air balloons. And to get messages in, carrier pigeons. So there's all these kind of really dramatic stories about people escaping in hot air balloons and sort of the carrier pigeons. And inside Paris, what happens is the workers, they don't have anything to do, right? Because the industry is ground to a halt. They're hungry. But there's a lot of wine in the kind of basements of Paris. So they basically sit in cafes and talk about politics. And they become increasingly radicalized. Really, the middle class and the elites of Paris they've fled. They've left because they're like, we're going to get out of here. We're going to go to some country home and wait out the Prussian siege. And so these workers are increasingly determined to fight the Prussians back. And they're very concerned that this new government is going to be too willing to give in to harsh Prussian demands, right? And I think it is that sort of question where you can say, they think, what is it that we're starving for? Are we just starving to, have another authoritarian regime, right? Are we just starving to give a lot of money and some land to Prussia? And the question, as we'll see, is yes, kind of. So there's a series of elections, the first elections of this new republic in February 1871. Now, half the country is under occupation. So you can't really have campaigns. And in these elections, the monarchists win. And they win primarily because they promise peace. And you could understand, if you were living under military occupation, you're going to just want to get those guys out of there. And so you are going to vote for the guys who will settle the peace as quickly as possible. But you have this paradox. You have a republic with a national assembly of monarchists, people who don't want a republic. And this new government, as you probably know, does quite rapidly sue for peace. So France pays this huge war indemnity. They lose almost all of Alsace and about a third of Lorraine to Germany. So this is a lot of land, right? It's a lot of places that the French consider theirs. It's also very wealthy land. This is where a lot of industry is. This is where a lot of coal reserves are as well. And so on the one hand, we could understand this desire to get the war over as soon as possible. But you could also understand why people in Paris are not happy with this peace. And they feel deeply betrayed and very angry at the new government. What had they suffered for? What had they starved for? Had they starved to give a lot of land and money away to the Prussians? And wasn't this government just another conservative, monarchist, repressive government? And they're also really worried that this government is based in Versailles, so right outside Paris, the capital of the old monarchy, as opposed to Paris. And they see this as, a kind of effort to decrease their power, which in a way it kind of is. And so the Versailles government tries to disarm Paris. They try and seize cannons that had been in Paris to fight off the Prussians. And as these two generals are trying to do so with their troops, Parisian mobs lynch those two generals and then drive the troops off. And so this is obviously the sort of Parisians are not happy about this move. The Versailles government, they could have negotiated. They could have said, hey, let's think of a compromise. But they decide, no, we want a confrontation and we want to beat Paris. And that's essentially what they do. So they withdraw from Paris and they start preparing for a full-scale confrontation. What this does is, once again, Paris is in the hands of radicals. Again, anyone who can is going to leave. So what you get is a city of relatively poor people who tend to be very left-wing and very attracted to socialism. And these radicals call for all of France to organize itself into a federation of municipalities. And they declare themselves the Commune, which was a term that had been used in the original French Revolution. And the Commune begins on March 18th, 1871. So when we think of the Commune, we often think of this as this period of radical social experimentation within Paris among these sort of Parisian radicals, where for the first time ordinary workers were in charge of Paris. And they have a really, really radical reputation and a very radical language. So they say, our flag, the French flag, is no longer the tricolor. It is instead the red flag of socialism. We are going to spread socialism to the rest of France. There's also these kind of feminist demands, right? So all these kind of women start saying, advocating for things like daycare and wage equality. And they do things like burn the houses of conservative politicians. They topple a monument to Napoleon I because they see it as too militaristic. They're sort of socialists, and so they want international peace. And they think that, sort of as socialists, right, all workers should be united. So you don't want someone who's promoting international war. So you got to get rid of Napoleon. They also, some of them talk about instituting a new terror. And Marx famously describes this as the dictatorship of the proletariat, as this kind of effort to create a socialist republic in France. If you actually look at their policies that they institute, they're really quite moderate, and they're more or less things that the Third Republic did a little bit later, like separate church and state, like free secular public education, things like pensions to soldiers of families who died, right? Or sort of these kind of more or less moderate measures. But the Versailles government sees this as a threat. And you have essentially two groups who are claiming to be the kind of true government of France. You have the Versailles government and you have the Paris Commune. And socialism versus more or less kind of conservative monarchism. And so the Versailles government lays siege to Paris. So that now we have another siege. This time, though, it's civil war, not international war. And they unsurprisingly win, right? The Paris Commune is just sort of absolutely outnumbered in terms of forces, in terms of, sort of the material that they have. And they, in May 21st, 1871, they enter the city. And they finish their sort of conquest of the city on May 28th, 1871. And this is a week of incredibly brutal street fighting. And they go from west to east. And this is important, and we'll talk about this next time, but they start conquering the city in these lighter parts, and then the places where they end up are these darker purple parts. And the final confrontation happens at Père Lachaise Cemetery, which some of you may have been to if you've been to Paris, where they kind of, the Versailles army just rounds up a lot of the kind of remaining communards and shoots them against a wall. Yeah. In this period, about 20,000 people are shot in repression. And afterwards, 40,000 are tried. Many of them deported to penal colonies outside of metropolitan France, like New Caledonia, for instance. On both sides, but particularly on the side of the Versailles government, there's killing of innocent civilians. The Paris Commune, they kill some of their hostages and they burn some buildings. They burn City Hall. But basically the Versailles troops, some of the generals and some of the politicians on the Versailles side, they see this as their chance to liquidate people who they didn't like. And the sort of word that they say, or the phrase that they say is, à Paris tout le monde était coupable, which is to say, in Paris everyone was guilty. If you were in Paris during the Commune, you are a threat, right? And so they use this as a way to sort of mow down a lot of the people that they saw as being in their opposition. So that's the beginning of the Third Republic. Now, this is not a great way to begin a new political system. And the government, is, as I said, again, quite conservative. That you have this majority of monarchists who are elected to the National Assembly. They restrict the free press. They're initially very close to the Catholic Church. And they think, we're going to have this republic for a few years, and then we're going to convert it back to a monarchy. And so their plan is, you have this Bourbon pretender. He's the descendant of the Bourbon line. And this is that guy up there, the Comte de Chambord. And he's a little bit batty. He's actually much older than this. This is a picture of him when he was much younger. He's a little bit batty. But the thought is he's going to die soon. He doesn't have any children. And then when he dies, we'll give the throne to that Orleans branch, the cousins, who are much more moderate. The problem really is, and this is where luck comes to play, the problem is that the Comte de Chambord is so batty that he is unacceptable. And he basically says, I will be your king. I'm happy to rule over you. I'm happy to sort of come out of my exile and rule over one of the wealthiest nations in Europe, but one of my demands is I don't want your tricolor flag. I want the old Bourbon flag, so the fleur-de-lis. And there are a couple monarchists who are okay with this, but there are a lot of monarchists who are like, nope, this guy is too crazy. He doesn't recognize that the 19th century happened. He's not willing to keep any gains of the revolution. He's just another absolutist. We know how that ends, so we're just going to keep the republic. And the quip is that for this, the Comte de Chambord is the George Washington of France, So the solution then is that you're going to put the head of the army, this guy, Marshal MacMahon, who was the guy who led the Versailles troops into Paris, you're going to make him president. And he's monarchist. He's deeply conservative. And he'll be president until the Comte de Chambord dies. And then we'll basically have a royal descendant who comes back on the throne. The problem is that Republicans start winning elections. People find out, even in the countryside, that they kind of like democracy, right? They kind of like not having a king. And so in 1876, the first national elections since those 1871s, you get a really overwhelming majority of the deputies to the National Assembly being Republicans as opposed to monarchists. So there are 155 monarchists, 340 Republicans. So you have this deadlock, right? You have a president who is monarchist and a chamber of deputies who are Republicans. And what MacMahon does is he says, we're going to have a whole new series of elections in 1877. And he more or less tries a kind of quasi-coup, like a legal coup, but a quasi-coup, which is he calls for new elections, he starts barnstorming around the country, he suspends officials who don't support him, he enlists clergy members to preach at the pulpit, to vote for him, but it doesn't work. And the Republicans win. Their margin decreases. So there are 323 Republicans, 209 Royalists. So there are not as many Republicans as there were in the earlier series elections, but this is the defeat of the monarchists. And this is basically the monarchists just say, all right, we're stuck with a republic. So to think about why this republic stays in place, unlike the First Republic, that begins in 1792, and the Second Republic that begins in 1848, we can think about sort of why this happens. So unlike previous republics, this is not a government that radicalizes. It does not move to the left. It proves that it can be real repressive during the Commune. The Commune also has the effect of getting rid of a lot of socialist leaders and activists, so there's actually not much pressure from the radical left, at least in the early years of the Republic. The other thing is that you have really a kind of rise of moderate republicanism, which is to say republicanism increasingly in this period is not associated with socialism, but is backed by essentially middle-class men who want protection of property. And they're willing to compromise with the workers, but they fundamentally, sort of figure out we want a regime that is founded on respect for private property, kind of moderation. We can figure out a republicanism that isn't socialist. And so that becomes the sort of dominant strain of republicanism in this period. The other reason that I think the Republic is so successful is that the Republic, beginning in the 1880s, really takes efforts to establish themselves through education. In the 1880s, this guy, a politician named Jules Ferry, he's the Minister of Public Instruction, so basically the Minister of Education. He establishes a series of laws called the Ferry Laws, no kind of excitement about the name, that establish free, compulsory, and secular education. So you can send your kid to Catholic schools, or to a religious school, or to a private school. But now, in every village, there are state-run primary and secondary schools. And those schools have an absolutely uniform, standardized, centralized curriculum. And this is actually still very much true today in France. That sort of famously, kind of, if you're, if you had a grandchild in second grade in France, and they were, I don't know, learning like a sort of particular math lesson at sort of 9:48 on a Monday morning, that would be true for every single second grader in France, right? It's a kind of quite, in many ways, rigid curriculum. And it's really the teachers who are important. So the teachers, one of whom you have pictured here, they're the shock troops of the Republic. And what this means is that in every town, there is a local authority who is absolutely dedicated to Republican values. So you have the priest, who largely isn't. You have a mayor, and who knows what the mayor thinks. But you also have the teacher, and you know exactly what the teacher who will think. And they really see themselves as missionaries for this political system, that their effort is to convert the peasants to the Republic. And teaching is a really prestigious occupation. And they're really only sort of second in status to the mayors in the villages. So there are these people who come into these villages and they have this kind of connection to the political system and are seen, they may also be one of the few people who is literate. And so they're seen as having this kind of really important authority. So these teachers, they teach reading and writing, but they also teach patriotism. Absolute devotion to France and to the Republic. And what they do is they give their students a national identity. They give students who are, the kind of children of peasants, right, who primarily would have had a regional identity, as Breton, as Normand, right, as from Languedoc, and would have spoken a regional language as opposed to French. They give people a national identity as French. And this is part of this effort that there's this great book on this. It's by Eugen Weber, who wrote the France fin de siècle book, and he calls it Peasants into Frenchmen. Right? You take these people who really don't have much of an identification with France. They have they're sort of regionally rooted. They know the village next to them. Maybe, they go to a regional capital once in their life. How do you give them a national identity? And you give it through schools. And so what this does is this converts peasants to republicanism, right? So you had a lot of peasants who, maybe it's a little problem because they have the vote, but they don't know how to read. So if you don't know how to read, how do you know who to vote for? But you also had peasants who many of them were ardent monarchists. And so how do you convert them to the Republic? This is also really important in converting women to the Republic. So here you see these are just boys because the schools were not coeducational, but you would also have girls' schools. And in those girls' schools, you would teach those girls that they should be devoted to the Republic, to France's government. And so the idea is then you get the mothers on board, right? Because those girls will grow up, they will produce a next generation of French citizens, and they're not going to be so Catholic, right? They're going to be really, really excited about the Republic as opposed to the church. And so it's partly about the sort of generational transfer as well, and this effort to convert both peasants and women to a different type of politics. And you see, I put what's inscribed on the blackboard. I translated it and put it on the PowerPoint. And this says, the nation which has the best schools is the best nation. If it is not true today, it will be true tomorrow. And I think that's a really important phrase, because you got to think, what other nations are there? Well, there's Germany. And we really want back Alsace, and we really want back Lorraine, and we really want revenge. And so how are we going to get that? We're going to raise our kids to be absolutely, militantly devoted to the Republic, so that when the next war comes, they will go off and they will fight with pride and with enthusiasm. And that's exactly what they do. So that's it.
United States, we tend to view the Seneca Falls Convention as the start of women's rights. How does that really start in France?
It's a really interesting question. So there are, in the French Revolution, so starting 1789, there are advocates for women's rights, some both male and female. But it's really, it's more in the kind of later part of the 19th century that you start having more feminist organizations, more feminist voices. But it's always a real minority position in France. It's a much kind of less prominent movement in France than it is in the US or the UK, for instance. And one of the reasons that women actually don't get the vote until 1944, right after the war. So one of the reasons is that you have all these Republicans in the Third Republic, and they're like, well, we don't want to give the women the vote because they're just going to vote for whoever their priest tells them to. So there's really this kind of fear that if you give women the vote, you would have the return of the monarchy. And that's one of the things that kind of really inhibits the French sort of feminist movement and feminist demands. And it's not until after World War II when you had a lot of women who were in the resistance. And the thought is you kind of, they've shown that they are loyal. And they're loyal to the Republic, and so we'll give them the vote to sort of thank them, and because they've proved themselves to be loyal. Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
How did they find or train enough teachers to go to all the villages and spew this party line?
Yeah, that's a great question. They start schools. So they start basically teacher training schools, and some of which are still, in kind of operation today. But it's an effort that really starts under Napoleon and then kind of dramatically escalates in the Third Republic, is to have professional, highly prestigious schools to train civil servants of a variety of ways. So in France today, the most prestigious schools are really ones that are designed to train civil servants. So you have, if you know anything about the educational system, for instance, the École Normale Supérieure, which is really to train sort of high school teachers and then above, and it's incredibly hard to get into, and it's very prestigious. Yeah, so you have to have this like actually sort of huge administration and this huge kind of effort to write.
Were they paid? Were the rural teachers paid through the central government?
Yes, they are paid. So before you would have rural teachers who were maybe not paid so well, right? And there's a real effort to kind of ensure quality. So you have a lot of inspectors school inspectors to ensure quality. And this is actually, to your point, this is where a lot of women start finding employment as teachers or as these sort of in the school administration. And so it creates this kind of professional class of women. Yeah, great question. Mm-hmm.
It looks like the church would have seen this as a direct attack. Suddenly they had the only person in the town who led the priest, and now suddenly there are lots of people in the town. Did the church try and fight back?
That's a good question. So in general, yes, and we'll talk about that with the Dreyfus affair. The church is very hostile to this republic, and really not happy about it. One of the things that happens as a result of the Dreyfus affair in 1905 is that the church loses a lot of power and a lot of wealth as well. I don't know sort of in individual villages, right, whether you'd have these kind of struggles, the degree to which you'd have a struggle between officials, right, between sort of church and secular officials. That's a really great question. But certainly on a kind of macro level, yes, absolutely, the church is not happy. Mm-hmm.
From the time Louis XVI got beheaded through the terror, and up until the time Napoleon took over, who was running the French government and doing things governments do, like running the war against other countries in Europe?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's this period of the revolution that no one ever talks about because they feel it's really boring. Although people have started to say, actually, it's more interesting. It's called the Directory. And it's this kind of basically an executive of you have five executives, and then you also have a bicameral legislative. And it's corrupt, it's inefficient, It's not terribly popular, and really they have this one success which is war. But it's this sort of strange period in French history. They're really trying to think about like how do we create a republic that can be stable, and they create this kind of bloated, corrupt a governmental system to do so. Because the thought is just make things really slow and inefficient, and you won't have radicalization. Oh, yeah.
When church and state were separated in France, Alsace was not a part of France.
That's right.
My understanding is that the differences remain to this present day.
Yes.
Could you comment on
Yeah.
schools and the thing?
Yeah, so there's, so the separation happens in 1905, and it removes a lot of funding from the Catholic Church because the French state had funded a lot of the church. And, but of course Alsace is part of Germany at the time. So when Alsace comes back, it has the church is sort of much more, I think, integrated into the fabric of things like education. And that remains true to this day. It's actually this incredibly complicated system because technically in France today there is separation of church and state, but in fact a lot of funding for religious organizations comes from the state. And so it's never, I think there's this thought that like in theory church and state are separate. In practice, they really never fully are. And Alsace is one of those cases where they're never, when Alsace comes back, they're never fully separated right. And there's not an effort to kind of alter that, in part because Alsace is Protestant, and the thought is the Protestant church isn't dangerous to the Republic in the way that the Catholic Church is perceived to be dangerous. Yeah, great question. Yeah.
To follow up on the previous question, when Napoleon became first consul, I thought he only had 2 other people he had to deal with.
Yes, so the Directory is in power from, I think, 1795 to 1799, and then Napoleon comes in 1799. And he says, we're gonna shift to the consulate. And he's the first consul, and then there are 2 guys who were the other 2 consuls, and he, unsurprisingly engineers it so he's the one who has all the power. Yeah, so they're 2 slightly different political systems, but it's basically this, in theory you don't want to have one man having all the power. In practice, of course, you do have one man having all the power. Yeah.
From 1830 on, I guess, with the birth of the modern, how would you define the French economic system at that point?
Yeah, so it's, we'll talk a little bit about this, I think, tomorrow, but you have industrialization. In France, it tends not to be kind of large-scale industrialization, so that's a little different than in Britain. You have a lot of small shops, basically, what we would call sort of sweated industry, which is not necessarily machine production, but a lot of hand production. You do, starting at the end of the 19th century, you start seeing a kind of, really kind of mid-19th century, 1860s, you would start seeing, for instance, a second wave of industrialization with much larger factories. A lot of them are in the northeast of France, so in the kind of around Lille, and eastern France more generally. And that tends to be kind of these much larger factories. But France has kind of traditionally, still true today, kind of a lot of handcrafts, a lot of luxury production, and a lot of kind of small scale manufacturing. That being said, I think it's really important the degree to which France is overwhelmingly agricultural. So I think it's kind of the vast majority of people are farmers. And that's really true until the mid-20th century. So France has this kind of very slow, long industrialization, which is different than sort of the UK or Britain, which have these kind of much more rapid surges.
You said earlier that your students feel that the French are bad at war.
Yes.
That when it would begun in Sedan.
Yeah.
And was that army going through, was it modernized at all? I mean, not as much as the Prussians, I understand that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there had certainly been kind of, right, there had been the Crimean War, right? This is not the first time during the Second Empire that they fight. I don't think they're as modernized as the Prussians, but really they, the Prussian military machine is just hard to come up against, right?
And a leadership problem also.
Yeah, there was also a real leadership problem. And really, the French sort of ideas about war, and I had a student do a great project on this, is basically the kind of partly the sort of revolutionary enthusiasm, and we're going to count on the enthusiasm of the people, but also partly cannon fodder, and that's more or less how Napoleon, the first Napoleon, wins it, and that's more or less why France, holds out as long as it does and is on the winning side in World War I, is just a kind of willingness to, send your population to the war. Yeah, great question. Mm-hmm.
Are the ferry laws still in effect today?
Yes.
And what effect has that had on education with a large influx of immigrants?
So it's a really, the question of secularism in the schools is one of the major sources of debate in French politics, and it has been for the past, I would say, 20 years. Particularly the degree to which Muslim girls are allowed to wear headscarves, right? Because the thought is that these are secular schools. And also, French students don't bring their lunches to school. They eat in the cafeterias, and there are also debates about whether you can have halal meals as well. And so these have been these kind of it's really the schools that have been the place where this has been debated. And I think it's the kind of the centrality of the schools to the Republic, which begins in the Third Republic, helps us understand why schools are this place where these ideas are really sort of hashed out and debated in France in this kind of very unique way, partly because the feeling is that these schools are the laboratory. They're where the Republic is created, and you need to sort of ensure that sort of process is happening.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank
Sarah,
you.
excellent.
There was a great question. Thank you.